All right, so in Chapter 5, Section 7, we're going to be using congruent triangles. Remember that in all the other the other sections, sorry, we were proving triangles to be congruent. And now we're going to actually use the triangles that are congruent. So this is sort of wrapping up why we do what we do. Okay, so again, how do we prove that two segments or angles are congruent? Well, first thing you could do is you can prove that two triangles that they're in are congruent. Okay, so in other words, if I have a segment in one triangle and a segment in the other, or an angle in one and an angle in the other, and I want to prove that they're congruent to each other, the first thing that I need to do is I need to prove that the triangles that they're in are possibly congruent. Once I prove the triangles are congruent, then all the corresponding parts are also congruent. Okay? The second thing is state the two parts are congruent using the reason corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And we call that CPC-TC. Now again, so I'm going to go into more detail. It will make sense, but again, how do I prove some segments or angles are equal? First, prove the two triangles that they're in are congruent, and then I can say that all the corresponding parts are congruent. I can list the things that are congruent, and I can say they're congruent because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And it's CPCTC, and you're going to use that a lot. So I'm going to show you what they want us here, and this will make sense. So again, here I'm given a proof that they want me to write. Okay, they want me in this proof to prove that angle Q equals angle S. So again, I'm going to start with my statements. I'm going to start with my reasons. Okay, and I'm going to try to understand what it is that they're asking me to do. So let's kind of go with what we've been given. They tell you that PR bisects QPS. Well, if it bisects angle QPS, okay, and I know that's my given, I'm going to see what can I conclude from that. Well, if PR bisects QPS, then that means that QPR is going to be equal to SPR. Okay, and how do we know that? Well, we know, let me do angle QPR is congruent to angle SPR. And I know that they're equal because I know what the definition of congruent, not congruent, definition of angle bisector. Okay, I know that that means that it breaks the angle into two congruent angles. So the definition tells me that. The next thing that is given to me is that PQ is congruent to PS. So this segment here is congruent to that segment there, and that's given. Now, what they want me to prove here is not that the two triangles are congruent. They want me to prove that angle Q and angle S are congruent. They want to know that this and this are congruent. Well, guess what? I have no information about that. So how can I prove it? Well, remember in the previous thing, step 1 says prove the two triangles are congruent. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to look here at these triangles, and I'm going to see, well, what do I need to prove the triangle's congruent? Notice right now I have a side and an angle, and I also know that PR equals PR or RP. The line equals itself. I know that that's the reflexive property. Okay, so reflexive property of congruence. And so now I know that triangle QPR is congruent to triangle SPR. And how do I know that? Well, because I have angle include, oh my God, sorry, not angle. I have side. I have included angle, and I have side. So I know side angle side postulate is the reason or theorem. And notice again, I've proven that because I have the angle here, I have a side here, and this should be congruent, and I have another side. So again, I have my whole side angle side here. So if my triangles are congruent, right, what can I conclude then? Once I know my angle, because notice that's not my final step of my proof. Well, guess what? Once we know that two triangles are congruent, we know that all their corresponding parts are also congruent. And so what that means is I know that this third side here has to equal this third side here. I know that this second angle equals this angle. And I know that this angle must equal this one. All these other parts, everything I put in green, I know because once I know that the two triangles are congruent, I know all their corresponding parts are congruent as well. And so I know they want me to prove that angle Q is congruent to angle S, and it is because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. So once I prove the triangles to be congruent in step 5, then I can list all the parts that are also congruent, and the reason would always be this, CPCTC. This is the point, this is the purpose of us finding out that two triangles are congruent. So again, let's do another one here. Same concept. Okay, again, let's go with statements. Let's go with reasons. Again, I'm going to start with my first statement. PR bisects angle QPS and angle QRS. And that's given. Now, let's go to the drawing. If PR bisects QPS, this angle equals this angle. And if it also bisects QRS, then I know that this angle has to equal this one. So I've got a couple things to write here. First thing I'm going to write is angle QPR is congruent to angle QPR SPR. And angle QRP, the one on the right, is congruent to angle SRP. And both of these, the reason I know they're congruent is because I know the definition of an angle bisector. And I know it breaks it into congruent parts. So, again, the only other thing that I know in this triangle right now is that this side equals itself. And so I know that segment PR is congruent to RP. And the reason I know that is the reflexive property of congruence. So I've got that. So now I'm ready to say that the two triangles are congruent, right? I know that triangle QRP is congruent to triangle SRP. And again, the reason I know it, notice that I've got angle. There's an angle over here. And I have the included side. So that's going to be angle side angle. Okay? So now I know the two triangles are congruent. Obviously, that's not what they're asking me to prove. They're asking me to prove that RQ equals RS. So where's segment RQ and where's segment RS? Well, RQ here and segment RS is over here. So again, remember that once I know the triangles are congruent, then I can start talking about all the other things that are congruent. For example, I know angle Q has to equal angle S. I know that this side over here equals this side over here. And this third side equals this third side. So yeah, QR or RQ is going to equal RS. So I can automatically jump over to the proof RQ is congruent to RS. And the reason I know that they're equal is because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Again, once I proved the triangles were congruent, all their parts that match are congruent. And this is the reason every single time. And then we have one more proof we're going to do here. Again, we have our statements. We have our reasons. And again, when I look, I'm going to go with my given. They gave me for step 1, WX is congruent to YZ. So I'm going to go to my picture and I'm going to kind of write that in. So I've got WX here is congruent to YZ here. That's given. And then it also says that ZY is, ZW is congruent to XY. So ZW is congruent to XY. That's also given. They want me to prove that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. Well, again, I've got to figure out here what's going on. First of all, I'm going to prove that the triangles are congruent, and I'm going to start by inserting my second step, which says that ZX is congruent to XZ. This line here in the middle is congruent to itself because I know it's the same line, which means it's reflexive property of congruence. So now if you notice, I've got 3 sides of my triangles. So I know that my triangles, let's call it, W goes with Y, so we're going to do W. Let's do WZX is congruent to triangle Y, to triangle YXZ. And I know those 2 triangles are congruent because of the side there. Notice that again, I proved the 3 sides equal the 3 sides. So now I know that all my corresponding parts are going to be congruent. So angle 1 is going to be congruent to angle 2 because of CPCTC. And again, I'll show you how I know that. Again, when I come over to here, basically the angle in between here, between the angle 1 and 2, this angle W is going to be equal to this angle Y, okay? I've got the angle that's in between the single tick mark and the diagonal, that's angle Z, okay? And that's going to match, again, this one here between the single tick mark and the diagonal. These correspond together. And then angle 3 and angle 4, okay? So again, I know that angle 3 and 4 are corresponding and congruent, 2 and 1 are corresponding and congruent, and W and Z are corresponding and congruent, okay? And so it's a little bit easier to do angle 1 than it is like angle Y, Z, X, and all that weird stuff. But again, the reason that those angles are congruent is because I proved the triangles were congruent before, and then I just made all the corresponding sides equal, because I can't. Once I know triangles are congruent, I can make everything equal.